Hi guys. Today we're going to be talking about introductions and thesis statements, which is maybe something that you've heard about before, but it's always a good reminder as important parts of writing that a lot of times people kind of overlook, especially introductions. The importance of those introductions are really, key to setting yourself up for success with your audience. So it's something that you definitely want to spend some time thinking about. And then also having a thesis statement is an important aspect to, writing a really solid paper. So let's get started. The probably the most important thing to realize about introductions and thesis statements is that you really cannot write an introduction or a thesis until you've done all the work for the rest of the paper. So a lot of times people will start writing their paper and they'll say, well, I got to come up with an introduction and I got to figure out what I'm going to say. Well, no, really what you should have when you start a paper is you should already know kind of what's going to be in the body of that paper. It's not to say that it won't change. It's just to say that, you know, if you don't know what's going to come in the body of the paper, you're not going to be able to effectively introduce or guide the reader beforehand. So a lot of times an introduction or a thesis is one of the last things that you'll end up writing for the actual paper. Today, we're going to practice that by using this short little poem called First Grade by a poet named Ron Kurtke. And so if we were going to write a paper about this poem, we would first need to understand and analyze the poem, right? Like we need to know kind of what we're going to say. So this little poem goes like this. Until then, every forest had wolves in it. We thought it would be fun to wear snowshoes all the time, and we could talk to water. So, who is this woman with the gray breath calling out names and pointing to the little desks we will occupy for the rest of our lives? So, I, as the person analyzing this poem, am going to look for keywords and phrases and what kinds of ideas are associated with those keywords and phrases. And I've identified essentially four phrases that I think are key. The first one is every forest had wolves in it. And you can see that I've written it down in my little worksheet here. Every forest had wolves in it. Also, please notice that I've indicated the line break with a slash. That's really important when you're quoting poetry. And then the associated idea is that, that there's this kind of childlike imagination and fear, and that monsters are hidden in dark places. Forests are dark and mysterious and scary, especially to children. I've also identified this next phrase, we could talk to water, which I've cited there in my worksheet. And again, I'm noticing the imagination and childlike kind of wonder of, the natural world, I guess, talking to water. It kind of reminds me of a waterfall and the movement of rivers and the way that the burbling kind of sounds like talking or like baby talk or things like that. The third phrase that I've identified is who is this woman with the gray breath? Again, I've noted the line break with a slash. And I wrote in my associated ideas that it reminds me of a witch. There's this kind of old sense to her that she's got this gray breath, kind of stinky and possibly dead, and she's this kind of unpleasant person. Again, a very kind of childlike sense. And this final line, little desks we will occupy for the rest of our lives. Again, you can see the slash where the line break is in my citation there. And this associated idea is the idea of feeling trapped and hemmed in and having this kind of lack of freedom. So when I look at all of this and I try to analyze it, I can think to myself like, oh, it seems like this is a poem about kind of the wonder of childhood and the loss of that wonder, like the fear of losing the wonder of childhood, the imagination, the imaginative parts of childhood. And so if I were to write a paper about this, I would probably use these at least some of these quotes or these phrases, and talk about how they lead into the poet's attempts to explain what it is that happens to the imaginations that we have when we're children. And so once I've done that analysis and I've picked out my evidence and I kind of know what I'm going to say, especially if this is going to be kind of the body section of my paper, then I can start figuring out what my thesis is going to look like and what my introduction is going to look like. But notice again that I had to do all of the hard work first. I can't start with the introduction and the thesis statement. So now that we have all that figured out, we can really start thinking about how we can put our introduction together, and a thesis being that part of the introduction. And the introduction is really, again, it's about giving the reader a sense of purpose for the rest of the paper, setting them up to understand all that hard work that we just did in the previous on the previous slide. So when we're thinking about introductions, we know that an introduction has to accomplish a few things. The first thing that an introduction has to do is grab the reader's attention, but we need to make sure that we grab the reader's attention in a relevant way, which means that however we grab their attention, it needs to be related to the ideas that are going to come up in our paper. And remember that in this case, our paper is talking about like childhood and that, the imagination of childhood and what causes the loss of childhood, right? And the loss of imagination. So for this particular one, we would want to make it relevant to that. We also need to provide context for the reader, which means that the reader needs to know, like, why are we even talking about this topic, right? So that means introducing in this case, we would want to introduce the poem and the poet and things like that, making sure that they understand, like, there's a reason that we're talking about this. We don't want to just like throw them into this situation and not have them understand, where it came from, right? And then we also need to inform the reader about what we're going to prove, right? So we need to make sure, and that's the thesis part, we need to make sure that the reader is expecting what is going to come in the rest of the paper. So they kind of understand how it all ties together. And so when we write that, then the thesis statement, which is almost always, in this case, it's going to be one sentence. When we write that, we want to make sure that it's a complex sentence, that it's one sentence, but it's not a short sentence, that it integrates different elements of complex ideas. So that means having a where, like where does the work come from that we're doing? In this case, that would be the poem and the poet and, other important information about its origins. Uh, it includes what kinds of evidence we're going to look at in the poem in this case, or from whatever documents we're working from. If it's not a poem, if it's something else, what kinds of evidence are we going to be pulling from that document? And we're also going to need to talk about, or we're going to at least need to hint at the why and the how that the evidence is going to be important. Like what kinds of things is that evidence going to show when we write about it in our body paragraphs? So with that in mind, let's look at 3 different examples. The first example is going to, one last thing before we move on. The thesis is almost always, and in this case we can just say it is always, we can talk about other situations at another time, but the thesis is always, in this case, going to be the last sentence of your introduction. So after you've done those other 2 things, grabbing the reader's attention and providing context, then that last sentence before you move into the next paragraph is going to be your thesis statement. So now we can look at our 3 examples. I'll show you an acceptable example, a better example, and then a superior example based on the work that we did on the previous slide. So here's the acceptable example. You can see I've bolded the thesis statement. I've also provided the poem again if you want to look at it. But it says, everyone has that first memory of school, but for some people that memory is positive, while for others it might be negative. Many people wonder about why we have such different experiences, and lots of suggestions have been made about why some people end up liking school while other people don't. In Ron Kirky's poem First Grade, keywords and phrases create experiences for readers to see how school for some people defeats their imagination, which might be why they don't like it. So you can see the grabbing of the reader's attention. It talks to everybody, right? So everybody can relate to this. And it talks about how some people like it and some people don't like it. So, anybody could kind of connect to whether they like school or don't like school, they can connect to this statement. So that helps to grab the reader's attention. We've got some context, being provided mostly in the thesis about the poem, the poet's name, and the poem's title. And then we've also got, more context about, a little bit more context about the experience of school and things like that. We've also got in the thesis statement, we've got the where, so like again, Ron Kirky's poem First Grade. We've got the what kinds of evidence we're going to look at. We're going to look at keywords and phrases, and we've got the why, how, that those keywords and phrases are going to talk about how school defeats imagination and using that to explain why some people dislike school. And by the way, in the poem, if you hadn't picked up on it, the teacher is this woman with gray breath, pointing students to their desks, right? Let's look at a slightly better example now. So better introduction and thesis than that other one, which was fine, might go like this. Remember those moments of childhood where everything was magical, new, and exhilarating? When traveling to space or the bottom of the ocean was as simple as closing your eyes and letting your imagination take over? When a game of lava tag with friends really did feel like life or death? Poet Ron Kirky certainly longs for those days again in his poem First Grade. So there's our introduction where we're grabbing the reader's attention, this time with a couple of questions that allow the reader's imagination to fill in the gaps, which is kind of nice, right? Things are magical, new, and exhilarating, and closing your eyes and letting your imagination take over, and giving people a little bit of a hint, like, oh, here are things that you might have experienced, but they can also let their imagination take over and remember their own childhoods, kind of grabs their attention. The context is in another sentence where we introduce the poet, Ron Kirky, and the poem's name, First Grade. And then that last sentence, the experiences and ideas that emerge from his keywords and phrases suggest that it is school that suppresses and ultimately kills the imaginative wonder of early childhood. So it's again a complex sentence. The where actually is in the previous sentence, but then we move into the what, the kinds of evidence, the experiences and ideas that emerge from his keywords and phrases, right? So we're going to look at experiences and ideas that are coming from keywords and phrases. And why and how is that going to be important? Because they're going to show us how Ron Kirky is talking about how school is this suppressant of the imaginative wonder that we experience as children. The last one, the outstanding introduction and thesis, might sound something like this. As little kids, life bursts with excitement. Everything is possible. You can breathe in space, wrestle giant squid, or talk to superheroes just by closing your eyes and letting your imagination take over. But as we get older, so many of us seem to lose that connection to our creative side, and life becomes dull, monotonous, stale. Why does this happen, and what can we do about it? Couldn't we all stand to reconnect with our childlike senses of wonder? So in this case, we're grabbing the reader's attention very similarly to the last one where we're providing examples and allowing the reader to kind of fill in the gaps and remember their own childhood. But we've also got this nice flow of short and long sentences. You know, some of the short sentences really punctuate some main points, while the longer sentences allow the ideas to kind of fill in a little bit. We're um, we're providing context for the reader in that we're kind of giving them the sense that we're going to be exploring this idea of, you know, of school and what happens throughout our lives, and like, you know, giving them reason to kind of think about these big ideas. And then that thesis statement comes at the end where I say, Ron Kirke, the poet who penned First Grade, certainly wonders the same thing, suggesting through the poem's experiences and ideas that it is in fact school that kills our childlike imaginative wonder. And so here we've got the where, which is really, it's the poet and the poem's name again, the what, the kinds of evidence that we're looking at. In this case, we're talking about through the poem's experiences and ideas. And then so we know that, you know, we'll bring those up. And then finally the why and the how those pieces of evidence that we're going to point to kill our childlike and imaginative wonder. All right, so similar to the other ones, but just a little bit more eloquent and refined in this final case. So with all that in mind, you're going to be using our previous work on other poems and other documents to work on your own introduction and thesis statements for those pieces of work. Of course, you can reference this work and this lesson to help you with that, but do be prepared to share your work.